Hi, this is a League of Legends fan fiction piece. The disclaimer can be found on the YouTube comment thing, description page. I'm not a writer, never have been, never was my intention. But here it is. I warn you, my wording is sometimes a little odd. And there are a few things that are out of place, like the fight scenes. He was sitting in the shadow of the window, privately reading by the last day's dying light. He could just barely hear the crowds cheering for the champions and challengers as they were paraded into the arena. One by one, each fighter would walk around and show off some moves, all while their intro music played. The type of sound system that this arena had made the walls shake. He shook his head and smiled, glad that it was not his turn. Today they were working through the A side of the tape, so it was all the challengers and lower level fighters. He, along with the other higher levels, were on the B side, so yep, he was good for a while, so he continued his reading. The arena became quiet, but he paid no mind, even as it stayed quiet, longer than it should have. Nope, he paid no mind, continuing his reading until he heard something faint and familiar. He tilted his head, listening, and then leaned back against the wall. His glasses clinked against the stone as he waited. It was still faint, but the familiarity was confusing him, because he should not be hearing it. Not yet. Maybe I'm wrong, he thought to himself. But as the music hit its opening crescendo, and his glasses rattled from the vibrating walls, he knew he wasn't wrong. He slid down from his spot, careful to stay unnoticed, and made his way into the pit's outer rooms. Quickly he moved past a group as a voice called out, "Hey, why aren't you out there?" But he hurried past without answering. As he entered the outside, immediately he could tell something was different. The crowd was cheering for him, but they also seemed confused. "Well, because I'm not out there," he said to himself with a smile. He walked out into a crowd, but kept his cloak on, so that he was able to stay somewhat hidden from them. He figured he would discard it as he jumped out onto the arena floor. He was tall, but the crowds bouncing around obscured his view of the arena floor and the ease of him getting to it. Between the spectators he glimpsed movement in the arena. Curious, he jumped up to a ledge, scaled a shadowed wall, up to where he would normally be sitting. He climbed over the railing of the covered balcony and approached the front where some of his men were standing. They quickly moved aside to allow him to see the fully cloaked figure as it half-heartedly waved its covered arms at the crowd. The cloaked figure walked around, slowly, then headed toward the exit. The figure stood there as if waiting. Then it turned its hooded head and looked at Benny, whom was inside the doorway to one of the area's hypogea. The hood of the cloaked figure concealed the figure's face, except for a few errant hairs that glinted red in the day's end sun. The song ended, and his men began asking him questions, but he held up his hand, silencing them as he heard a conversation from somewhere below the balcony. Was that? Someone else interrupted. "Yeah, I don't think so, but if it was, he sure does make a pretty fighter." He beckoned his men over and said, "Find and follow that fighter." As his men turned to leave, he quickly added, "But don't touch, just report." They nodded and left him standing alone. The fur around his throat tickled the back of his neck, and it blew in the wind. He breathed deeply, taking in all the familiar scents, and one new one. He sat down on his chair to think while he tapped his glasses against his knee. Someone else came through the dark doorway, but he spoke without turning toward them. "Nexus, we are going to need to speak with Benny." Nexus whispered, "Of course," and left. Alone he sat, still tapping his glasses. Soon he would know who the song stealer was, and they would pay for their thievery. Not because it was all that important, but because, simply put, nobody steals from him. The Great Hall. Chapter 2. The cloak was sitting at a table in the Great Hall, studying notes that were written in an under-earth language, and was recommitting them to memory, what the champions looked like. Quietly murmuring, amphibious, has a frog-like appearance. Next champion resembles a see-through dragon. The hooded head shook, adding, "Ugh, good thing that one is not here, because I'm not ready to go up against the granddaddy of the universe." Then with a sigh, the cloak thought to itself, "I wasn't prepared for all that showboating and parading around. They expected me to show off some fighting moves, which of course is no good because I have none. The original idea was to fight, win, and leave. All that extra stuff is unfamiliar territory. In fact, I wouldn't have known where to go if it hadn't been for that guy controlling the lights and doors. Oh, mental note, I need to find him later and thank him for being so..." The cloak's thoughts were interrupted by someone's fist suddenly slamming down on the table. "You thought you could hide, didn't you?" The hood tilted toward the guy's direction, but stayed low. Someone else sat on the table, on top of the cloak's notes. The hood tilted that way, looking up slightly. The second goon looked surprised as he searched the hood to see more than what he saw. "So you're the thief?" the second goon asked in a gruff voice with smelly breath and an equally bad odor coming from him. The hood spoke. "I did not steal nothing." The hood's voice had hesitated as it was trying to sound an equal, but then its good sense got the better of it, and it added, "anything." The guy wiped his hand across his face, snot and other unpleasance smearing his cheek. "Oh yeah, you did. You stole my boss's song." The first goon said, pointing a thumb across the room. The hood quietly responded, "I most certainly did not. It's mine." And then, keeping its hood low, it followed the direction of the pointed thumb and looked across the room. Some guy was sitting in a throne-like chair up on a platform. Even sitting down, you could see that the guy was tall. His muscular build and fist toys gave him away as a fighter. The hood didn't look all the way up, but it could see a bare chest and red fur. Whomever it was seemed to be turned away and talking to someone that was standing next to him. The hood sighed, still keeping its head low, but looking just a little higher. The hood asked, "And that would be..." At the same time the first goon answered, the guy on the platform stopped talking to that someone and turned his gaze to the hood. "That would be the boss," the first goon said, as the second goon followed up, "Set, the boss." The hood recalled the name, but not as a legend. "So he's your boss?" the hood asked the first goon, looking toward him. He answered with a duh tone, The boss is everyone's boss." The second goon nodded in agreement. Rolling its eyes, the hood began gathering its notes, except for the one that the goon was still sitting on. Just as the hood looked up to nudge the guy aside, another fist landed on the table, but this one had metal across the knuckles, and one of its pointed tips kept the note in place. "Do you know who I am?" the newcomer asked. The hood didn't have to look up to know who it was, but for this red-furred creature's blatant audacity. The hood tilted, turned from the goon, and then rolled and looked up at the newcomer. As it did so, the hood fell back and the green eyes flashed. They glanced across the room at the now empty chair and then back up at him. Her voice replied, "No, should I?" The red-haired man stared down at her and chuckled, replying, "Yes, it's the same me that was over there, and yes, you should." His gaze was piercing, but she held her own and answered back, "Yes, I can see that, and what do you want, Mr. the Boss?" she asked, adding emphasis at the end. "Oh, so you do know me," he spoke with mild surprise. "Only since your goons here made a mention," she replied. He nodded and continued, "I want to know who you are and who you think you are." Her green eyes looked confused, but she answered strongly. Who I am, as well as who I think I am, is the same answer, she replied. And what would that be? He asked. Well, that depends. Are you a challenger, a champion, or just another onlooker? She questioned haughtily. Several faces around them snickered, and some were laughing, but he wasn't. His eyes narrowed as he quietly asked, Do you not know of me? Of my reputation? Equally quiet, she asked, Should I? Without moving his hand from her paper, he stood up, still speaking to her, but loudly, like he was announcing it to the room. Since you do not know of me, then I will forgive you this one time for not knowing me and for not knowing my song. He smirked and looked around at his audience, nodding his head, knowingly, as if he was approving his own decision, until he heard a quiet voice say, My song. Like slowly swooping in, he leaned down close to her and whispered, I'm giving you an out. She whispered back, I don't need your out. He moved back only slightly and studied her. Then quietly he asked, What makes you think it's your song? She shrugged, quietly answering, Because it played for me. Again he stared at her, but then suddenly he smiled and stood back up, his hand still holding her paper down as well. As he still looked at her, he announced, So it has come to my attention that... He paused and lowered his voice and asked her, Oh, what is your title? Taking a breath, she answered, Jen. Anything else, like Jen the something? He offered. She shook her head, quietly answering, No, just Jen. He gave her a look and then continued, loudly, So it has come to my attention that just Jen is claiming rights and ownership of my song. As soon as he said it, the crowd maddened, crying out boo as well as other unmentionables. She had held his gaze, standing up to all his words, even though she was actually sitting. But she had not faltered. He shook his head at her, saying words that she could not hear through all the noise, but since he had said them very slowly, she could read his lips. They do not sound happy. He smiled, then turned away from her, gently scraping her paper along the table as he walked away. He didn't damage it, but as soon as he released it, she grabbed it and all the rest of her papers. As he walked back, he realized that he had collected quite a crowd, and they were all cheering, booing, or both. Ah, he thought to himself, there was nothing like getting the crowd worked up, and he was good at doing it. It wouldn't be long before the word would spread and ticket sales would go up. Of course, he didn't personally intend on going any further with this matter. He had made his point, but it would make the arena masters very happy, and he as well, since he had a stake in those sales. He sat back down in his chair, and Nexus, whom was sitting in the chair next to him, started wrapping a warm towel around his arm and began rubbing his muscles through the towel. I sense something more with her, Nexus said in a whispery voice. Set scoffed. You think she can beat or even match me? Then he chuckled, adding, Nah, she won't even retaliate. He paused, then quickly continued, And what's an under-earthling doing here anyway? Nexus shrugged, then started working on his shoulder. He continued, Doesn't she realize that she has sentenced herself to death? He became quiet as he sat and stewed on his thoughts, and then moved on to some other thoughts. There were 2 buyers looking to make some deals, but he would have to send his men before he could meet with them, so they could gather information for him. Then there was a 3rd buyer. He planned to send some of his men to meet with that buyer, but with this sale he was required to be there, just not visible. He needed to be hidden somewhere between the upstairs and the downstairs. That way he could hear the buyer and the buyer's brother, whom would be hiding upstairs all at the same time. Because those brothers had extremely good hearing, and those 2 were shisty. Luckily for him, he too had fairly good hearing and could catch whatever the brothers said. Of course, the brothers already knew about his hearing, which was why he had to stay hidden. Unfortunately, none of his men, at least the ones that he brought with him, were savvy enough to handle any of it on their own, but it would be a good training exercise for them. He had left his more intelligent and already trained men at home to man the pit while he was away for the tournament. He sighed. Training exercise or not, he would have to be very selective on whom he would be sending to these meetings. His thoughts were interrupted by a quiet commotion across the room. It appeared that one of his men had spilled something or made a mess of some kind, but there were too many people huddled about in that corner to be able to see anything. A moment later, he saw the cloak, hood up again, exit out into the hall. As he wondered what had happened, he heard a sound beside him. Sometimes when Nexus spoke, it was sometimes to answer his questions that were not in the forethought. There were questions hiding in the back of his mind. But the place was so loud that Nexus, being the quiet talker, could barely be heard. Set had to lean in to hear the words. Bloody is not the only way to best man. While he listened, he watched as the cloak waited a moment around the corner in the hall, and then going the opposite way, it snuck out through the outside doors. Nexus, he started to say as he turned to look at his masseuse, but Nexus, had already anticipating his words, had already removed hands and towels from his arm. Then Nexus gave him a knowing look along with a raised eyebrow, answering the unasked, "Yes, we shall continue later." But the raised eyebrow spoke silent volumes of doubt as he stood up abruptly. He caught a glimpse of movement outside the window behind him. It was the cloaked figure moving quickly down the hill. 3. Chapter 3. He couldn't help but wonder why run in a direction away from the arena since challengers are supposed to stay inside the arena for the first night setups. He knew he really shouldn't worry or wonder, but curiosity killed the goblin, you know. Well, that and gingivitis. He left the great hall and headed upstairs where he could get a better view. The upstairs window had a good view of the surrounding outside, as well as the door she had exited. Everything looked calm, nothing out of the ordinary, and then he spotted her. Somehow she had already made it down the hill and was heading into the market. "You're fast," he said as he leapt out the window and skillfully landed already more than halfway down the hill. No sooner had he entered the marketplace when he heard a male voice say, "Hey, isn't that the boss?" It was followed by some girly gasps. "You mean Set? Where? Where?" Diving, he rolled under the table skirt of one of the stalls, startling the vendor. Set looked up at the man as he put 2 fingers to his lips and gestured, "Hush," and then pointed in the direction of the incoming crowd. The vendor winked knowingly at him and then asked with a thick and foreign accent, "Lover trouble?" Set shrugged and rolled his eyes. The sound of running feet could be heard as they pounded past the stall. The man turned away to face outwards. Yes, I help you with something?" The vendor grinned, excitedly adding, "Today we have big sale for slushies. If you buy one and get 2 when you buy another one." Set quickly did the math in his head, then smiled and rolled his eyes. No thanks, we're looking for Set. Have you seen him?" one of the kids asked. The vendor gave them a confused look as he replied, "Set? No, yes. He run past that way." The vendor pointed in a direction. Set gently tugged on the vendor's pant leg. The vendor glanced down at Set, whom was indicating a different direction. The vendor, smiling, looked back up at the kids and said, "No, wait, you mean Big Man. Oh, yes, no, he went that way," he said as he pointed in the direction that Set had indicated. A mixture of voices could be heard cheering and the sound of their feet as they pounded off in that direction. Set chuckled as he rose to his feet. The vendor looked at him and said, "Oh, you have male and female troubles. Set, still chuckling, said, "Yeah, but thanks for saving me a lot of headache." He pulled a card from his pocket and propped it up on a table that was beside him, saying, "Here, as payment, or as thanks." The vendor looked confused as he blinked at it, but replied, "Oh, yes, my thanks for fish picture. Later I get framed for around it." Set shook his head and explained, "It's a trading training card, not a framing picture. If you have more of them, then you can play a game." The vendor smiled, but was obviously still lost. So Set continued his explanation. "I'm not really familiar with them, but I think if you collect a lot of these cards, then you can play with them." "More fish?" asked the still confused vendor. Yeah, sure. There are more water character cards, but there are also other kinds too. See, each card has a character with hit points and special moves, and you use them to attack each other." The vendor suddenly looked wary, and Set realized he clearly wasn't making any sense to him. So he switched to another language, one that was universal and known to all species and races in all the worlds. Sighing, he said, "You can sell it and make money." The vendor's eyes lit up with recognition. "I can make money with card?" "Well, not with," Set started to reply, but the excited vendor continued. "And if I go fish, I get more cards and more money, rich in all the money?" he asked with gleeful wonderment as he stared at the picture of the fish. Set smiled, agreeing. "Yeah, but you gotta collect all of them, then after you sell them, then you'll make all the money." The vendor's eyes watered with delight, causing the little wavering stars in his eyes to sing cha-ching to the moon. "All the money," he repeated, his voice floating like a cloud. Set was unsure how to respond. Sure thing, guy," he replied, making a mental note to return within the next day or so to straighten this fellow out. But for now, he needed to go. Set ducked underneath the stall's outer table, then turned around to wave goodbye. The vendor walked to the edge of the stall, carrying a fishing pole and a red and white bobber ball, excitedly saying, "I go fishing. I gotta catch 'em all." Set enthusiastically smiled back as he replied, "I'll bet you do," then waved as he turned and walked away. "Yep," Set thought to himself, "I'll have to come back, and the sooner the better." The vendor grinned as he watched the nice man walk away. Then, remembering something the nice man had said, he looked at the card with a puzzled look. The big man had said that the cards could attack, but the vendor couldn't help wonder how that fish could come out of the card. He was leery, but curiosity had him leaning in as he examined it closer. He wondered, if I get too close, will it attack me? Stepping back fearfully, he squinted at it, wondering, can it catch me? Set dodged in and out from behind the stalls so he could avoid the Fanerati. Within minutes he was nearing the end of the stalls, but she was nowhere to be seen. The cloak had disappeared. He paused and then used his extra keen senses to look and listen. He could hear the Fanerati still calling his name as they headed in the direction of the arena, away from him. He heard one of his adorers' comments. Then he shook his head, mumbling, no cubs for me." He then caught the scent of meat, or dinner like dinner meat. He followed it, and walking in between some of the outer stalls to the edge of the market. As he stepped through, he heard a crunch. He saw that the ground was littered with them, so he picked up an uncrunched one and looked at it. They were called tree bar. It was like a leaf, and it was the color of a chocolatey brown. Inside the leaf's membrane was a substance called rick. If you walked on them, then you could make a crunch like a noise, but if you ran over them, then it would sound like a snap. And just now, he definitely heard a snap, followed by several more. He looked between the stalls to some trees that were far off in the far, far distance, and sure enough, there was a figure of someone moving fast through the forest. "Well, now, let's see if you're faster than me," he said, smiling. He pocketed the leaves and took off like a flash through the stalls and out into the woods beyond. Within minutes he was where he had seen the figure when it had snapped the tree bar. Of course the snap had not been loud. He had only heard it because of his keen hearing. Expertly he avoided stepping on any, not because he preferred the quiet, but so that he could hear his quarry. He could thank the wolf scoots for that. They were all about teaching the young pack survival skills like building and making fires, fighting, tent construction, hunting, although he credited his mom more with the hunting, and also tree sleeping and building net hammocks out of one piece of rope, and also how to talk to girls. Oh, yes, he remembered the wolf scoots well, because it was the best way to scoot when a pup had an itch back there. Continuing on, he could see the figure up ahead, climbing a steep hill. He looked up, thinking perhaps an aerial position, as he began climbing a tree. Quietly, he walked along the large branches, moving from one tree to the next, getting closer and closer to his target until he stopped on a tree that was one tree away from the hill. Settling on a branch, he watched and waited to see what the figure would do. The small, pale ankles were back and forth exposed as the fully cloaked figure finished climbing up the hill. It walked over to a small, flat, running stream. Hands on hips, the hood scanned the top of the hill until it found what it wanted. Racing over, the cloaked one picked up several stones and then walked them back over to the water, put them down, and arranged them around the water's edge. Then the cloak went to retrieve more stones, came back and dropped them at the water's edge. Then, in a peculiar manner, it began doing a strange dance. It held one foot up while hopping up and down on the other foot. "Strange creature," he mumbled. Then, seeing that the creature's foot was bare as it danced around the heavy stones, he chuckled. "Oh, that's why you're dancing," he said, rolling his eyes, and then added, "strange and frail," while shaking his head. The dance stopped, and the hood dipped low over the stones as the pale hands quickly moved over them and rearranged the stones that had strayed. Finished, the cloak stood up and walked further up the hill to where a large boulder sat. Pale fingers reappeared from within the cloak and began pressing against the boulder until the cloak draped itself around the boulder. Set shook his head, watching as the creature's shoulders would stiffen and roll, and then stiffen and roll. How does a weak underling think it can beat legends when it can't even push a rock? He said quietly. The creature stepped back and, seemingly in frustration, open-handed slapped the boulder. Then the creature cringed as it stepped back, violently shaking its hand in the air back and forth as if the hand was saying, "Dismissed, dismissed," several times, or "No, no, no," really fast. Again he shook his head, then chuckled. The cloak's flailing done, it then walked over to some other smaller boulders that it could move, and began rolling them down the hill along the curved slope, but then stopped them at the end of the slope's arc. The cloak walked over to the next boulder, which was the biggest of the smaller ones, and tried pushing that one, but it seemed to be stuck on the ground. The creature dropped to the ground, laid on its back, and then pushed with its feet. The boulder rolled, just enough that the creature could now roll it in place, using its hands. The cloak pressed and wiggled all the smaller boulders, digging them into the ground along the curve of that slope. Going back to the immobile boulder, the cloak kneeled on the ground in front of it and started scratching the ground all around the front and sides of the boulder. In a short amount of time, the scratching and the digging began creating a shadowed area in front of the boulder. Then the cloak was now down inside of that shadowed area. Now, with the cloak blocking the view, it was difficult for Set to see what else the scratching and digging was doing. All he could see was the hood hovering over its pale, slender fingers as they moved feverishly. The cloak moved again, which now allowed the moonlight to illuminate whatever dirty deeds the fingertips had been digging into, and still were. His keen senses felt something vibrate through the tree, and then his eyes widened as he realized why. Like the hand of a clock ticking, tick, tick, tick. The large boulder was shifting, and the creature seemed completely oblivious as it lay prostrate. Seemed completely oblivious as it lay prostrate in front of it, as it continued blissfully unaware to loosen the dirt which was the only thing holding the boulder back. With concern he stared at the moonlit-kissed fingers. The omens danced with an almost ghostly pallor. Set watched as the boulder slowly began to eclipse that moonlight and shrouded those ghostly dancers with a delicate doom. He had conflicted feelings. Perhaps it was better this way. No fingers meant no fighting, he thought, even as he stood up on the branch. So then you won't die within those walls, because out here only your hands will perish, he justified. Then he took a good look at the size of that greedy boulder, and he realized, no, it won't stop at your fingers, or your hands, or your wrists. It will continue to take until the cloak lies as flat as the ground. That which breathed within will breathe no longer. Without realizing it, without thinking, he grabbed the branch at his feet and dropped down while still holding on. Then he began to swing himself back and forth, building momentum, and then he swung around the branch. One, in a quick glimpse, he saw the boulder shudder, and he swung around. 2, and then he saw the last string snap as the cloak severed it. 3, and then the boulder began to roll, just as the cloak rolled safely out of the way. Seeing this, he changed his grip to instantly stop swinging. Hanging one-handed from the branch, he felt dizzy, but not from swinging. Kicking into the tree with his gold-toed spiked shoe, and still hanging by one arm, he balanced himself and continued to watch. The hood had rolled around to behind the rolling boulder, and then quickly moved into a squatting position. The cloak's hood had fallen back a little, and now revealed little curls of dark matted hair, and just the tip of a pale nose. The cloak leaned forward, putting its weight on its fingers as it eagerly focused on its boulder, which was now freely rolling down the hill. Just as it began to pick up speed, it hit the curve and slowed as it followed the arc of the hill. The boulder would have gone completely over the side and off the hill had the cloak not put those smaller boulders in its way. Hitting those roadblocks, the big boulder slowed even more, as well as it slightly changed its direction. Continuing along its new path, it picked up speed again, rolling down the hill and into the shallow water. The boulder seemed to skim the surface, rolling across the water, and then it collided with the pile of stones, rolled a little backwards, and then stopped. But why? Set wondered out loud, until a giddy sound drew his attention. The creature was rising to its feet, with hands together, but was clapping with just its fingers and squealing with the merriment of a child as it bounded down the hill after the boulder. It lifted its robes and stepped barefoot into the cold water. It was a warm night, but Set could tell the water was cold because the hair on the creature's legs prickled and because its body shivered. The creature climbed on top of the boulder, where it squatted on the top and produced something from within the folds of its robes, which it began stirring. The creature leaned its hooded head forward over the boulder to be almost upside down. Then it used a piece of material to smear the black stuff that had been stirring onto the boulder. He tilted his head and looked to see if the markings were some form of ancient script or symbol. Is this creature somehow using sorcery to create a happiness spell? He whispered as he tilted his head upside down and then squinted against the moonlight as he whispered what movements he saw her make. Dot, dot, and a swoosh. He put his head back up and added, or maybe it's frowning. But since it was drawn upside down, he heard the cloak giggle, so he added, yep, it must be smiling. He shook his head, thinking watching this odd creature was like watching the wreck of a locomotive. You want to look away, but you just can't. Actually, he didn't want to look away, but now he had to wonder, why didn't he want to look away? Theater always bored him, so why was he still watching this show? Speaking of, now the still squatting creature was moving around the top of the boulder and leaving darkness in thick spirals as it used the black paint to mark the water's edge, all the way up, completely covering the boulder. And then one last swipe included the face. Suddenly, from deep within the folds of the cloak, he heard a strange but oh so familiar sound. He didn't shiver, but it reminded Set of the strange people that lived deep in the woods. They lived in houses that were made of sweetbread that dripped with icing. As a youth, he and his fellows would sneak around and pinch little pieces to snack on until they heard that sound. It always made them freeze and full body shiver. Then their bodies, free of the sound, they would knock over the brooms that were always by the front door and scatter. It was an intelligent move because knocking them down in front of the door made it take longer for the occupants within from getting out and catching them. His mother warned him not to get too close or he might end up in their oven. So of course silly little Set climbed into his mother's oven, but his arms and legs were still sticking out. The sight made his mother laugh, and then she laughed harder when his smushed little voice said, "See, Mom, if I can't fit in your oven, how are they going to put me in theirs?" Set smiled at the memory, but then he noticed that the cloak had stopped dancing around and seemed to be waiting. Slowly, a small, pale hand reached down and hesitantly tapped one fingertip against the black surface, but then quickly withdrew as if it had been stung by an elbmub thorn. Then, oddly, the hand went back for more, laying all of its fingertips against the boulder's black surface. The night sky illuminated the pale fingers as they began to lovingly caress the dark moon which they had just created. Moments later, the fingertips rolled off the rock, curling up backward as they lifted up. The cloak rose, its skirts floating about as it spun like a flower budding to a bloom. It looked over its shoulder at the fruit of all of its labor, and finally Set saw what all the fuss had been about. The water, now redirected, was beginning to trickle down an overhang on the side of the hill. It dripped down to a raised and enclosed area on the side of the hill that was obscured by some bushes and a large tree. The tree stood like a silent sentinel, mute, blind, deaf, and dead, and yet, somehow, still seemed alert and protective. Set shook his head, thinking how clever of her, but unfortunately that water is still very, but his thoughts were interrupted by a thin smoke beginning to billow out from around the painted boulder. As the smoke rose up, it encircled its creator and was caught up in a soft wind that blew it around in all directions. The cloaked creature lowered itself down into the mist, staying atop the now creepy moon. The smoke made it difficult for Set to see anything through it, that he just barely caught a glimpse as a hand touched the black rock again. Again it recoiled, but this time shook back and forth as if it... "Oh, wait, that's not a mist," he whispered, as he watched the slightly burned hand continue its pained wave. The mist, as he had thought it was, had been thin, but now it was becoming more and more dense. From around the depths of the hissing water-bound moon, thick wisps of steam began to rise, and as it rose, so did the cloak. It stood up, which reminded Set of one of those twirled atop the black rock moon. Oh, sorry, I screwed up on that. Like one of those aforementioned creatures, the cloaked creature now standing over a large, bubbling pot, and began twirling atop the black moon, then tilting its hooded head awkwardly as it laughed, making that sound again, which made Set shiver. It made the child within him shiver, but it also made the adult him shiver, a different kind of shiver, that almost knocked him out of his tree. He lost his footing, but quickly regained it, then climbed back up the tree. Now he was sitting on the branch instead of hanging from it. Settled, he turned his attention back to the show, just as the cloaked creature dropped back down into the mists, but only for a moment. Suddenly it sprang up into the air, jumping high above the roiling heat below. Set watched in wonderment. "But it's not possible for your kind to fly," he whispered, while he watched the impossible. Like a petal unfurling, the cloak somersaulted over and over, arching its back and spinning round and round in the air, as its robes fluttered around it, revealing small glimpses of limbs that were so pale and so bare. Then the robes seemed to drip away, revealing all things pale and bare. The full moon was dim, and it was within perfect alignment with the hill, as she landed beautifully within the mists atop her black moon. Her legs were slightly bent from her light landing, but she stood up, righting herself and standing tall. She stretched her arms out, twisting them around in the air to lengthen her muscles as she arched her back, moving like something wild as she rolled her head and stretched her neck. Then she reached her arms up to the sky, clasping her hands together so the tips of her fingers kissed the moon. Set's breath caught in his throat, causing him to almost lose his hold of the branch and fall, because he hadn't realized that he was leaning so far forward. Repositioning himself, he stared wide-eyed and admired the phoenix before him, but instead of her having risen from the fire and ash, she had become from star and sky. She jumped down from atop her rock, avoiding the boiling water, then walked toward the overhang. She stood at the top, toe-checked the temperature. Sitting down on the edge of the cliff, away from the water, she grabbed a hold of an old root protruding from the dirt, and then let herself fall, while still hanging on to the root. She hung there, dangling, until she held up her ankles and wrapped them around the root, and then her hands let go. Now hanging upside down, she searched out the next root and repeated the process, root after root, until there were no more roots. With her hands holding on to the last root, she dangled a moment, kicking her feet around, and then she dropped down, landing on the ground. She walked over to the water that was rushing over the overhang and rubbed her hands together, cleaning off the root debris and dirt. Then she retrieved the bag that was hanging on the old tree and started pulling out her supplies, starting with a brush that she carefully worked through her matted hair. Then she stepped into the water. When she had been up above, her silhouette within the moonlight had been dark and defined, but down below, only half of her enclosure was exposed to light, while the other half dwelled in darkness. Where she stood, she was bathed in both. Set breathed in deeply, sampling all the scents that were surrounding him: trees, flowers, dirt, sweat, and meat. He breathed in again. Yes, meat mixed with something else that was just as intoxicating. Now that his mind was no longer capsized in that steamy mist that she had been somersaulting and stripping in, the hunter within could focus. With that in mind, he breathed deeply and found the origin of the scent. Without her cloak to cover her, the earlier spill on her was evident, even blatant to his senses. He followed each scent as the water carried them through her hair, down her neck, down her back, her thighs, where they dripped down her legs, mingling with the mud at her feet. They dripped from her hair. It was intoxicating, the smell of freshly seasoned rare meats mixed with the salty scent of her skin. She rubbed and conditioned with soaps and other perfumed concoctions, which now also added the scent of berries, mint, lavender, cumin, as well as other various and foreign plants that he may not personally know of, but their scents were now forever locked in his memory. The strong smells intermingled with each other as they mingled within the water. The dirt, sweat, and sweet were washing away, but all those scents would linger on her for a while. It was making it difficult for him as he had to fight to keep the animal in. Thinking of many bad things but nothing good, he bit the tree. He took a chunk out of it, and then he buried his face in its open wound to breathe it in. He had to break the continuity, stop the tendrils of scent sneaking in and slithering around, stabbing its venom-filled fangs into him. It was like a parasite that was now in control of him. It was forcing him down the tree. His feet moved freely, but his hands dragged deep gouges through the woods of the tree, in protest until he dropped to the ground. Continuing his non-compliance, he refused to use his legs to walk. So then he became like dead walking as his hands, which were now complying against him, dug themselves deep in the dirt, and he began crawling, slowly but surely, toward the target. While dragging him along, something was eating his brain, causing his limbs to alternate their usefulness for him and against him, and when not in use they hung at odd angles, like a weirdly limbed puppet with invisible strings. He was being forced to climb the dead sentinel tree's roots. Somehow his body had made it to the top, and his target, with her back to him, was standing unawares in front of him. With his last ounce of strength he begged himself, and then reason was gone. He could only watch as his body lurched forward towards her, and just as she was turning around, something inside him used his powerhouse strength. He dove on top of her, dragged her down, and buried her deep, deep in the mud. He quickly spat the tree trunk out of his mouth and shook his head, horrified, wondering what had just happened. But even as he tried to recall it, the memory was already fading. Again he shook his head, thinking, well, whatever it was, it had worked. He sniffed the air, and whereas the scents were still very pleasing, they weren't overly intoxicating anymore. She was still standing under the water, almost like no time had passed. He watched as she pulled something up onto her hip. Wait, you weren't wearing clothes? You were wearing clothes, were you? He whispered loudly. She tilted her head as if she might have heard him, but then she rubbed her ear and got the water out. He sighed in relief if she had caught him there, fine, but he preferred not. Now she was doing something to her hand. Squinting, he watched her put tiny piles of mud across the top of her hand and mold them like little tips. Then she laid a thin mud line across the tops of her fingers. She spread her fingers, breaking the lines, and stared at her hand. Breaking into a sudden giggle, she washed off her hand as she stepped out of the water and squeezed the drips from her hair. Set could see that yes, she definitely had something on. They looked like undergarments, but not your typical undergarments, because somehow hers seemed to cover more of her skin. All finished, she bagged her things, all her soaps and cleaning agents, then retrieved her cloak, washed it out, and then ran around in circles out in the big clearing to air the cloak out. Then slowing to a walk, she walked away, past the still falling waters, past the tree, and past him. She whipped the cloak over her shoulder and headed back toward the arena. He waited until she had been gone for a few minutes before letting out a deep breath and then dropping out of the tree. Literally. He let himself fall and just slam into the ground because he needed something to knock some sense into him. This whole evening reminded him of the books his mother liked to read. Fantastical stories of romance, sometimes aggressive, as well as near impossible things, which really described this night to a T. Well, minus the rape thoughts. Thanks to his mother, rape wasn't his thing. But it wasn't just those thoughts. It was all the thoughts. They made absolutely no sense. Like the boulder thing? Had he really felt those vibrations from that distance? He had never been that in tune before. He yawned and stretched his muscles as he stood up. That pounding made him feel a little more like his old self, so he too started walking back to the arena. While walking, he rubbed his sprained wrist. Pain. It didn't really bother him. It was just part of his charm. Chapter 4? She felt great as she walked back to the arena. It was late, but a few shops were still open. But probably because the shopkeepers and vendors were standing outside discussing their winning picks. She donned her robe before they saw her, because she intended to just pass on through. But as she walked past, she overheard, "Can you believe an under-earthling is in? I mean, with their fragile health, you would think it would be against the rules," some woman said. Jen paused just beyond one of the stalls and stopped to listen, also occasionally peeking. Another voice replied to the first, "Well, why not? One time they let a middle earthling in, and they're a frail race too." "Yeah, but they have some magic, not to mention those big hibbit feet, which is what allowed that little guy to walk across sweaty, fire-hot, mountainous muscles of moldy doom." There was a collection of nods, followed by some guy with a quiet voice interjecting, "Yeah, I don't think it's pronounced hibbit, and that guy didn't have magic, just some fancy jewelry." The woman laughed. "Did you know that even when they are young, they already have those big feet?" Some other woman responded, "Oh my, can you imagine what it's like when they let them out of school? The noise those little ones must make as their big hibbit feet pound the floor." Both of the women laughed, adding, "Oh, how cute." Some guy that had not spoken, at least not since Jen had been listening, spoke up, rudely and loudly. "So as I was saying," he said, in a tone that emphasized how annoyed he was at being interrupted. Jen chanced to peek and saw that everyone was giving the guy the same look that she was giving him. He either ignored or was oblivious to their stares as he continued, "Underling ain't got a chance, and she's already ticked off one of the champions." He didn't look angry," said another voice. "Oh, he was, trust me," said Rude Dude, knowingly. "I got this info firsthand, from a girl who got it from a guy named Joe. You don't know who Joe is, and you don't want to know, but he was sweeping the floors 2 rooms over when he overheard everything from the Great Hall. The whole fight." Jen added a comment as she mouthed, "I passed him, and he was 3 rooms over." Another guy started to protest what Rude had said, but then Rude cut him off, saying, "He's a misconstruent, and you know they always speak the truth." Then the guy who had started speaking finished, now kind of mumbling, "Well, yeah, but don't they also have horrible hearing?" Rude ignored him, even though Jen saw the others nodding their heads as they agreed about the horrible hearing. Rude continued, saying, "So like I was saying, the boss is ticked off because that under-earthling tried to steal his song." At that comment, Jen made a hidden gesture and then repeated it. "Yep," he said, rubbing his hands over his belly. "Won't be surprised when they find her body in an alley all mangled and bloodied from them brass knuckles. Course he'd actually be doing her a favor, considering in the arena only champions can—" But she had heard enough and was fuming as she walked off. "His song? No, my song. They gave it to me," she said quietly as her anger carried her through the dark and quiet market and all the way back to the arena. Seth had easily caught up to her, but then followed her at a distance. He stopped when she stopped, so she could put on her cloak. And then he stopped again, just between some stalls. When she stopped again, just between some stalls, he stopped in the alley, opposite of that alley that she was in. Leaning against a key log tree, He kept out of sight, but watched as she tilted her head to the side, a dim light revealing her partial profile from under her hood. He listened to the shopkeep's words, and then watched her reactions, especially when she angrily pointed back at herself several times. He chuckled and shook his head, thinking, "So you still think it's yours?" He watched her stomp her feet a few times, and then angrily leave. He waited for an opportunity when the shopkeepers had their attention elsewhere, and then he followed her. As he approached the high stone walls of the arena, the heavy door was just closing behind her. He wasn't cold, but he stopped by a fire pit and rubbed his hands together while looking up through a window. There he saw a shadow moving quickly towards the great hall. Only champions had their own rooms, so the challengers had to bed down together in the great hall, which was not the greatest place to sleep. With all the late-night merriment and then the early morning cleanup crews, unless you had a pair of wrathworms or some beetle cotton, good luck getting any sleep. Oddly enough, though, it seemed kind of quiet tonight. But then, of course, there was the other problem. Out in the great hall, now you're just fair game. He pulled out the wrist sleeve, flipped it over in his hands, and then snapped it and threw it in the fire, where it crackled and then popped. He smiled, remembering those sounds. He watched the firelight dance, which reminded him of how she had moved against the moonlight. Again he glanced up at the great hall window and remembered. She was fair game. He shook his head. "Well, good luck to her. I'm going to bed," he said, yawning, as he walked away from the fire and went inside. As the doors closed behind him, his memories of the evening became very distant, and some just disappeared. Chapter 5. A bruising bite. She had calmed down and was now making herself comfortable. Well, as comfortable as she could. It was dark in the great hall, especially with the moonlight hiding behind the clouds. She had to feel her way to get to where earlier she had been directed that she would be sleeping. The wall had recessed cavities that housed some makeshift mattresses. The whole setup reminded her of something that she had read about called the catacombs, and how it was the dead's final resting place, or at least it was in another world. The book had been one of many that filled the shelves in her parents' home. She couldn't remember a lot, but she could remember the tall bookshelves that were overstuffed with books. Well, they were until that night, when they were stolen. She shook her head, refusing to think about it, and trying to think of something else. Anything. Well, her mind answered, "These makeshift mattresses are stiff and grimy and smelly." "Ah, yeah, that's a great subject change," she thought, sighing. Giving up, she laid her cloak down diagonally, and then she laid on top of it, pulling it over herself and wrapping it around her, securely, so even her feet were covered. She exhaled a relaxing sigh as she settled in. But then something made her wrinkle her nose. In the great hall, occasionally there were noxious and unpleasant fumes floating about. Holding her breath, she had to remind herself that she was stuck here for a few days and she would just have to deal with it. After a minute, the smell wasn't complete. Holding her breath, she had to remind herself that she was stuck here for a few days and would have to deal with it. After a minute, the smell still wasn't completely gone, but was enough so that as long as she kept her face buried in the bedding, she could somewhat breathe again. Closing her eyes, she let the sounds of her logging camp neighbors lull her to sleep. Suddenly, she felt her secure and wrapped around her cloak become unsecure as someone yanked her loose and clapped a hand over her mouth. She struggled as something else grabbed her arms and legs, attempting to hold her down, but she fought back and won some freedom to start kicking back. When she smelled something sweet next to her face, she quickly moved away from it. She didn't recognize it, but she was no fool and figured that whomever this was, they were trying to drug her with something. She squirmed backwards toward the back of the alcove and at the same time tried to find her knife, which had been right next to her. One of her kicks landed solidly against something, and she heard a groan, but then whatever it was that groaned replied with a stab to her leg. "Ugh, my knife!" she thought, in pain. But how did... Unfortunately, she did not have time to wonder. because something had grabbed a handful of her hair and was yanking on her to pull her back out. She struggled as she pulled, but then something boxed her ears and made everything go completely dark and dizzy, as well as the ringing from it had thrown off her balance, which she found out when something tried to stand her up, and instead she kept falling sideways. Her vision was hazy, but she could still see one thing. One of the challengers was a magic user whom had a shielding ability. Jen could see one of the sleeping niches in the wall had a dim blue light covering its entrance. Smart, she thought, just as her own lights went out. Something hit her and knocked her out, senseless. Something caught her just before she hit the ground, and was now scooping her up and bagging her. The bag was small, so she was unable to move around in it. From her upside-down position, she could not hear, she could not see, but she could feel her limbs going numb, and she could feel that she was being tussled about roughly. She attempted to call out, but her voice was already numb and not working. Panicking, she tried to fight and even scratch at the bag, but it just made her feel more numb and dizzy and exhausted. Suddenly there was a great jerk, a lifting feeling, and then the bag stopped moving. Oh great, she thought, they've hung me up on a hook. Then the bag began to sway, almost like she was flying. It reminded her of those birds that had those drooping beaks. As they would fly through the sky, they would hold their heads high, even though their drooping beaks looked more like heavy bags or blankets. The weight must have been difficult for them to fly, because they always looked like they were being so careful, as if they were carrying some precious cargo or something. Well, now she was just a babe in a bag, and one that seemed to be flying, but she really needed to find a way out of it, especially because it was becoming difficult to breathe. She kicked through the cold and numb feeling in her legs, trying to rock the bag, but then she felt that the sides of the bag tighten, followed by pressure, and then warmth against her cheek. And then she was swaying again. It was making her feel dizzy, and also the lack of air, or because of being smushed, her lacking the ability to breathe air. Her mind began to swim with useless thoughts, like trying to figure out where the warmth had come from. Was there someone next to her? Had they trapped someone else and hung them up next to her? She thought about some of the other challengers. Well, there was that little girl that was just so sweet and pretty. Of course she had been warned to not be deceived by looks, but come on, that girl was just so sweet and innocent looking. How could she possibly be dangerous? Well, Jen would find out later, but for now she focused on the innocent part, which angered her. If these brutes thought they were going to get away with brutalizing that child. Air came from deep within Jen's throat, and she growled. Again the swaying stopped. Suddenly, and again she felt some warmth coming in from somewhere, but then the sway began again. She was feeling faint from her shallow breaths. If she could just get herself right side up, then she knew she would be able to breathe better, but for now she was too weak to move. Just as she finished thinking all of this, she felt her body go upside down, which then made her right side up, and then she was pressed on top of a flat but somehow moving surface. Better now than never, she thought, and then she started kicking again. It made her gasp for air, so she split what was left of her lung capacity, leaving her with 1 centimeter for breathing and the other centimeter for fighting. Her mind, now suddenly thinking at a frenzied speed, was so fast that she couldn't catch her own thoughts as she continued kicking as fast as her thoughts were flying. Her kicking must have done something, because she was being moved again. Good, out of the bag and into the fight, she thought as she mentally prepared herself. What she wasn't prepared for was heat. She could feel heat as she was pressed up against a wall, a warm wall. A fire wall. They're building a fire. Now she knew where she was. She was in the kitchen, and the swaying was her hanging from that hook by the fireplace wall. Oh, if she could have moved her head, she would have shaken her head, because rape maybe she could deal with, but cooking her? No. Oh, no. Something shifted the bag, and a dim light came up through the mouth of the bag, which was under her. Just as she her cannonballed up self started to slide down, which was unballing her, she felt something very solid flatten against her and then against her stomach, and her mind yelled, "The cooking arm!" as she tried to push it back away from her. She was unsuccessful as the bag closed around her, taking away the light and trapping her arms against her. But she had seen the light, and now she was bound and determined to get to that light, because that was the exit. She started to kick again, but one of those brutes shook the bag to stop her kicking. They also loosened, then tightened the cooking arm, and they continued to repeat this action while they continued to shake her. She felt cool, and that she felt her clothes coming off, but then she felt heat. Her mind was spinning again, trying to figure out what they were doing and why did they keep pressing the cooking arm against her stomach. It was annoying, but it was also making her feel sick. She was sweating, but then she could feel the heat below her become cooler, so she figured that they had put a pot over the fire. The frenzied thoughts were coming fast again, and she started kicking again, ignoring the heat that was building again and coming from the hot pot below. The bag was being shook again as the brutes were trying to shake her out of the bag and out of her clothes, but she wasn't going down into that pot, and certainly not naked. She knew that somehow she needed to get out of the bag, and without being cooked. But before she could come up with her next move, she felt something cut her, as the bag slid across her cheek and over her head. A light flooded her eyes, and cool air refreshed her sweaty face. And oh, she felt it. Finally she was free of the bag, but not of them, and not of the cooking arm, which was still pressed against her stomach. Before they could drop her into their pot, she leaned over the cooking arm and kicked her legs against the firewall so she could loosen the cooking arm and maybe flip over it. She did go forward, over the cooking arm, but not enough to actually flip over. The cold metal, cold against her stomach, seemed to be breaking under her weight, because it dropped some, which then lowered her some, but it was stiff, unmoving wall behind her that stopped her from actually flipping completely around the bar. So now she was just hanging upside down over the cooking arm. Oh, great, she thought, as now she could feel the heat even more. She squinted, hoping that it would help bring her vision back. Her focus was blurry, really blurry, but she was starting to see undefined shapes. And call her crazy, but she could not see a pot below her or anywhere else around her. Her eyesight was still very hazy, but in the dim light of all she could see were maybe 2 piles of gold next to the fire. She didn't realize how focused she was on seeing until she was startled by something warm sliding down her arm and then across her chest and back up to her shoulder with one good push as it forced her back up, right, and also kept her in place. She was confused. A hand? But how did a hand come from way up there inside a fireplace? She struggled to free her arms, but the cooking arm tightened around her, pulling her back up and securing her arms again. As it moved, she suddenly realized that it wasn't metal. It was skin. Hairy skin. The hand slid from her shoulder to under her neck and held her chin up. Well, now she knew that someone was trapping her. She just didn't know whom it was, but she knew it was one of those smelly guys. She knew because she had smelled him through the bag, which may have been one of the reasons that she hadn't been able to breathe. And ugh, the jerk still smelled. He must not have liked the idea of sharing, so he stole the bag for himself with her in it. She could feel warm air by her ear as it seemed he was speaking to her, and oddly tugging on a bit of her hair. Unfortunately, even though her vision was slowly getting stronger, her hearing was completely gone. The thought was scary and making her anxious, but she tried to remain calm and watch for any clues that might reveal his intentions or how he planned on carrying them out. Straining her eyes so she could focus, she was able to see a large shape in front of her, but that's not what it was. Her attention was broken by him tugging on more of her hair and getting a little handsy. She shook her head, saying, "Get off," or well, she should have said "get off" if she could speak. She would have said "get off of me" if she could speak. He stopped messing with her hair and started moving forward, bringing her along since he still had her by the waist. She was feeling anxious again. She wasn't a big talker, but to not be able to talk at all saddened her. As she was moved forward, she really wished that she could speak. Breathing in sharply, she finally realized what room they were in. And nope, it was not the kitchen. Now she knew why his breathing was calm and slithery, because the kind of things he must have been saying to her. The thought sickened her, and panicking, she tried to squirm out of his hold, but his grip tightened everywhere. The 2 fingers that were holding her chin moved so that now his hand was around her throat. His lips moved against her ear, and his breath burned her. She tried to calm herself again, to think calmly, but she was in too much of a panic. She had worked too hard for this to happen now, because she's stronger now, stronger than when she was before. Thoughts of her being cooked for dinner were now being left in a kitchen that was far, far away. The actual intention was now becoming clear in the form of that undefinable shape, now becoming very definable, and what he was walking toward. She felt foolish with her mind reliving the thought that it had been a real arm, not a cooking arm, and so could have been moved. She felt a chuckle in his chest, which changed the rue to anger. Well, okay, funny boy, since my mind wants to relive it, she thought to herself as she raised her feet and used the same move that she had used earlier, but this time she was moving both feet in unison, and this time she wasn't trying to bounce over his arm. As both her feet slammed into both of his kneecaps, her mind answered his chuckle. I'll give you something to laugh at. Her move got a response as she felt his body seize up, and she waited for him to drop her, but instead his arms only tightened, excruciatingly more around her, as he dropped onto the bed, rolling to his side, taking her with him. He was also now squeezing her throat and choking her. She felt her blood beating in her head, as, still unable to speak, she begged herself, "Find your swordsman spirit, then maybe you can break this curse." Again she felt his breath in her ear, and again she heard nothing. But at least he relaxed his chokehold and the bone crushing. He was still holding her throat and waist, but now he was moving her head around and trying to mess with her hair again. So she did what anyone would do. She slammed her head against his, which, for a few seconds, stopped him, until he started moving her hair again. So she repeated, and every time he tried to control her head, mess with her hair, she'd slam his, and then she would squish down to hide hers. The battle went on like that for a while. She squirmed and tried to wiggle free, but then he would just tighten his hold. He would try to move around her, but then she'd slam her head against his. They seemed to be at a stalemate until he made a different move. She noticed that his breathing had changed, as his head knocked gently against hers. She felt the warm breath by her ear again, but somehow it felt a little slow, like hers. Then things were calm for a moment, and he slid his hand away from her throat, but paused and kept his hand close. She laid still and calm, but also alert, thinking that maybe he was letting her go. He reached over to a table, and she unsquished her head to see what he was doing. But when she unsquished, he stopped reaching and went for her hair again. "Whomever you are, you're not breaking my neck," she thought, as again she slammed her head against his. Immediately he went for the table again. She looked up just as he pulled a vial out of a drawer and flipped open its lid. She waited and calmly watched as he brought the vial closer. Then, when he was just close enough, she slammed her head against his arm, which spilled the vial, closer to him. She felt the vibration quietly rattle in his chest as he exhaled deeply. Good, take your own medicine, she thought, even though she didn't know what it was. Still, she figured she should mentally prepare for her escape, in case whatever had been in that vial would aid her somehow. She waited. He started speaking, and of course she still couldn't hear him, but his voice felt soft in his chest as he kicked his foot up in the air and used the tip of his shoe to open a window. Then against her, too slow, because she realized it was too late to protest, he wrapped his legs tightly around hers and he rolled over her more, locking his arm around them. Something was different about him. He seemed slower, and maybe she was too. Her struggle was not as struggling. There was a sweet smell lingering in the air around them, which was caught up by a gentle breeze that had come through the open window. His hand relaxed around her head and laid against her cheek. His thumb slid back and forth a few times. She blinked her hazy eyes, wishing she could understand the fading warmth of his voice, because within the beat of a restful sigh, his thumb stopped moving. His wrist slid forward, and his hand fell gently in front of her. His fingertips still touched her cheek, but now she could see his hand. Her eyes tried to open wide, but they just could not fight the fall. And so, just as sleep was taking her, and just as she realized she needed to move her face away from the sweet-smelling spill, she finally knew where she was, whose room she was in. Because whereas most assuredly there were many tall and strong guys around here, only one of them wore brass knuckles.